All right, guys, we are on to discuss the migration portion of population and migration. We made it all the way through the population portion, and so now we're on to migration. So I want to pick up right where I left off, right where the video cut off on the last video, and I want to discuss a few terms that come up quite a bit in this unit because normally I save these for the very end, and I think I need to go over review these at the beginning because they are important terms that you can see. The first is brain drain, and brain drain is simply a concept that applies to this phenomena that happens when people migrate out of LDCs or maybe developing countries and they go to get an education. They leave. Let's say they leave a country like India and they go to get an education in maybe the United Kingdom, or maybe they go to the United States, someplace to get an education that's not their home country. And after they become educated, they decide, you know what, it's pretty good here. I think I like my new adopted country. And so they stay. The problem is once they've left their home country and they don't go back, that knowledge that those people gained in their new country, it doesn't make it back to their old country. And so the old country doesn't get to benefit from it. And it's a real problem in developing countries, so much that many developing countries are going to start putting caps on people that are able to go to like MDCs to get their education. Or maybe they're going to say something along the lines of, okay, you can go get your education in the States or in the UK or, somewhere in Europe, but then you have to come back for an additional 10 or 15 years, and as a requirement of keeping your passport. So just realize that it does become a huge issue, and it tends to hinder the continuing development of countries, because that knowledge that could be applied to solving problems in places like India, it doesn't make it back there. Okay, so just make sure that you keep that in your mind. The second is the concept of remittances. Remittances are simply money that's being sent from someone's adopted country to the country where they were born or where their family is from. And this is something that people have been doing for forever. As long as people have been migrating, remittances in some form or fashion have been a deal. Now, of course, nowadays it's all, Western Union, and it's all, very official. But this has been happening for a very, very long time. My family, both sides of my family, they came through around the Ellis Island time of this country's history, and they would tell me stories about how not all of the family managed to make it in, because back then there were quotas and there were restrictions, and so the men would come to work and they would send the money back to their wives and to their children in the home country. So this is not much different than how things work today. But realize that for many countries, many LDCs, the remittances are a pretty big source of income, especially places like, if you think of places like Bangladesh, quite a bit of their income actually comes from remittances. But I want you to think about the dangers of this, because if you are a country that is heavily reliant upon remittances, and let's say something that's happening right now with the coronavirus impact, you may, let's say you're a person and you're working in this country and, you come from a different country and you've lost your job. You can't send those remittances back to your home country because you yourself don't have a job. And so this is happening on a wide scale. And so, or it can happen on a wide scale. So it can be really heavily impactful on countries that rely upon remittances for their economic development. And here's a really good map showing you they call them remittance flows of where the money is going to. And this is something I would actually, pay attention to, because this also tells you migration patterns. This would be actually a really good FRQ, because you can link development, you could link political to this, you can link population and migration to this. So anytime you see graphics like this or maps like this, kind of think of how could I word this into an FRQ question. So just some basic stuff about migrants. For the most part, men tend to outnumber women with regards to migration, although it's changing, especially in places like the United States. But our population is going to be different than the population of an LDC, especially with regards to education levels. So for the most part, there are some characteristics of migrants. The first is they're going to travel solo, okay? And I want you to think about, most of you have probably made a road trip. And I want you to think about when you were really little, how often you might have asked your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or whomever you were traveling with, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And yeah, that's a pretty good indicator as to the type of what you would experience if you were a young kid traveling, and especially if you're traveling internationally. It makes it a real challenge to try and bring kids, because kids have a specific set of needs, right? Especially young kids. You have to feed them and change their diaper, and they have naps, and then you may need to go find a job. Well, what are you going to do with the kid? Because you don't have anybody to babysit the kid, because you don't know anybody, because you're brand new to the country. So realize it's so much easier. Just back in the day, it was whether it was 100 years ago, 500 years ago, or even today, it's much, much easier to migrate without children than with children. Okay, so there are some models that you have to know for this class. And gravity can apply to several different units, but we're also going to lump gravity with the migration unit as well. So you have Ravenstein, Zelinsky, and gravity. And the great thing about this class, and one of the reasons why I love teaching this class, is because so much of what we teach is just simply common sense. It's common sense, but you're putting a name to what you see all the time, everything around you. And quite frankly, just kind of logical thought patterns of how we tend to look at the world's problems. So Ravenstein's migration laws, and he's got several here. I've got a bunch of them here, but the ones I want you focusing on are the ones that are in red. The first one that I want you really focusing on is this thought that migrants are going to move pretty much just a short distance. Why? Because it's expensive. Okay, it's expensive to migrate, especially if you're migrating from country to country. It's going to be an expensive proposition to do. I mean, think about, well, back when people were flying, think about how expensive it would be if you were going to fly from the United States to Europe. It's expensive. And there are always people that grumble, well, people in the United States aren't well traveled. Well, they may not be well traveled outside of their country because it's expensive. We're kind of, stuck in the middle of the planet, two big oceans on either side, and traveling tends to be really expensive. Okay. But if you are going to migrate, you're probably going to move a longer distance, and you're going to go to a big city, okay? Because it makes sense. Why on earth would you travel a population of, 500 people? Because you're not going to find a job there. Where you will find a job, however, is in a big city. Finally, families are less likely to make moves internationally as opposed to young adults. Young adults, because they have freedom, because they don't tend to have young children with them, and makes it much easier for them to migrate. Okay, moving on, we have Zelinsky. So Zelinsky's migration model it tends to follow demographic transition. And I want you to kind of look at the graph here. I don't know if I have my cursor, if you'll be able to see my cursor or not. But when we're looking at Zelinsky, notice you have, the two axes on there. One shows immigration, and then one shows emigration, or the movement outside of a country. So immigration is movement into a country. Emigration is movement outside of a country. And notice over time, two things happen. The first is immigration increases into a country, right, as a country develops. Emigration, or exiting a country, decreases. So these are some things to keep in mind, and kind of think about the reasons why. If you're a country that's highly developed, people aren't going to necessarily be, crazy to leave the country, but they are going to be excited to try and come into your country. Okay. All right. And of course, here's demographic transition, just to kind of overlay with Zelinsky, and just remember the reasons of what's going on here. So if this is back in like a stage 1 country, and we'll go through these one at a time, a stage 1 country, your natural increase rates are about 0. And this is before urbanization. And you just don't have a lot of money to be able to move. It's way, way too expensive. And so moving is just cost prohibitive. You can't do it. And if they are moving, maybe they're migrating, to follow animals or something along those lines. They're looking for food or maybe materials for shelter, but that's about it. Stage 2 and stage 3 of Zelinsky, this is where you have that rapid population increase. Remember, our population pyramids look like a true pyramid. And this is where you have tremendous movement from rural to urban, from countryside to city. Okay. And so sometimes, especially in our modern era, you can look up with cities, create or have cities that look like this, where resources are really pushed to the hilt and are strained. And so whether it's water resources or education resources or maybe even jobs, because of this, this is what pushes people to migrate. They say, I want a better life. I don't have a good enough life here for my family. There isn't an opportunity. I'm going to move someplace where there is opportunity, which typically is going to be an MDC. So this is the stage 2 and stage 3 societies. Stage 4, this is going to be intra-regional migration. Okay, so cities to suburbs and back, that whole trend of counter-urbanization, where you're moving from an urban region to a suburban region or rural region. And I've been having long conversations with some friends of mine that are realtors, and we kind of think that what you're going to start seeing after coronavirus is just a huge push for counter-urbanization. Like people are going to say, I don't want to be in the city. I don't want to ride the subways. I don't want to deal with the population densities anymore, because so many people have been stuck in apartments, in the middle of the city where they can't get out or where they don't have much room, and where, they're ripping their hair out because they're all on top of each other, looking for space. And you just don't necessarily have that in a suburb where you have much more room. Land is much cheaper, so you have much more room. I mean, this is bid rent theory, right? And so because of that, it's a much easier existence. And so I think counter-urbanization, especially in MDCs, is going to be a booming trend once we get through this coronavirus. Gravity model, this is actually something that applies to cities and urban as well. But pretty much what you need to know with regards to gravity model is kind of think of it like the gravity of the solar system. Larger objects tend to attract the smaller objects, and that's the same case in gravity model with migration. Larger places, larger cities tend to attract more migrants. And the longer the distance that you have from where the migrant originates to where their final place is going to be, the less likelihood you're going to have interaction between those two. That's a form of distance decay, right? If you're closer to a place, you're much more likely to migrate there as opposed to not migrating there. A couple of things with regards to distribution of migrants and U.S. migrant patterns. And you do need to know these. There have been some questions in the past where you'd have to talk about like historical migration. We've talked before about the triangular trade route. Sometimes, triangular trade route is one of the terms for it. Columbian exchange is another. But you typically see this where it's, you have Europe, and then you have Africa, and then you have the United States or the West. The Western Hemisphere, and there's these arrows that kind of show this relationship. And we talked about it before in culture with language, and of course this also has to connect to migration as well. But a few things to point out to you that a lot of kids don't realize, especially when we talk about forcible migration or slavery, the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. The majority of those migrants in the slave trade actually went to places like Brazil and also throughout the Caribbean. And this is important because you see the impact of that culture that was brought over from the African continent in those places. And so it's really heavily inundated the culture in those places. So this is an important timeline here where you see where people were migrating from and then to the United States. Okay, and notice that there are certain epochs or periods in time where certain regions had more migrants than others. Okay, I'm going to skip over those. I would make sure that for right now, the United States, the majority of migration into the United States at this time is from Mexico. And this is both legal and illegal immigration. It's both from Mexico. But going into the future, just a few years into the future, the thought is the majority of migrants will be coming from Asia. Okay, so very soon, migration coming into the U.S. will be, the dominant force will be from Asia. Okay, I'm going to skip over all this. I do want to make sure that this has to do with the population center of the United States. And this is like if you were to balance a piece of paper on a pen, or a pencil and try and find the balancing point. Okay, as the time has passed, the people in the United States have moved further west and further south. And if you look on this particular map, you see the breaking point right at about 1950, where you start to see this solid trend moving south and south and south and south and south, or I should say southwest. And that is due to two really important inventions. The first would be air conditioning, okay? And the second would be the advent of the automobile. Both of those inventions really helped to solidify the settlement of the South during post 1950, post World War II. Okay. And so that's why cities in the South tend to be bigger and more spread out because of the automobile. And of course, guys, if you've ever been in the South in the summertime, you know it is hot, but ACs make it so much more manageable. And, I live in Houston, and you go, especially like it's August, and you go from one air conditioned place to the other air conditioned place to another air conditioned place. And all of our, the way our buildings are constructed, they're constructed what we call really tight, meaning that they don't have a lot of leakage from air, just because you want that cool air to stay in the building. You don't want it to exit. Notice the trend here of migration in this country. This kind of continues to show, for the most part, where the gains are located. And you could see this pattern of people moving west and moving south. And so that's why I think with the next census, and of course, realize that on this slide, it has it doesn't have 2010 on here. 2010 is the center now. But I think with the 2020 census, you're going to see a really, real sharp turn south, because there's been so much migration south over the past 10 years. And this is another census form showing this change, and movement of people and where people are moving to and where they're moving from. And you could see, along the Rust Belt region, actually, if we just updated a bit more, this map, you would see tremendous loss from the Rust Belt region. So let me kind of show you where the Rust Belt region is. This is the region that runs really from New York State all the way over to Illinois. And this is where there used to be manufacturing hubs back in industrialization times. But of course, due to outsourcing to China, all those steel mills shut down, all those manufacturing facilities shut down. And a lot of that business, all of those plants shuttered. And Bethlehem Steel is, of course, the most famous one. But a lot of those places shut down and business went elsewhere. Okay. And so that's why it's called the Rust Belt, because it's an area that used to be very, very wealthy, but then collapsed over time due to basically the manufacturing base that evaporated. The Sun Belt region, this is the region that runs from the East Coast to the West Coast, all along the southern portions of the United States. And this is where you see tremendous migration in. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why people move to the South. Part of it is the weather. I know my family's from the North, and they said, boy, they don't miss the snow at all. They would tell all these stories about the snow that they'd have to deal with up in the North when they were growing up, and they said they don't miss it. They miss the mild summers, but they don't miss the freezing cold winters. So part of it's that. Taxes are relatively low in the South, and you tend to be able to get more for your money in the South, especially with regards to real estate. And so that's just some of the reasons. Business climate tends to be a little bit better. There's a whole host of reasons why people are moving south. Businesses are also migrating south. So that continued southern trend will grow. And of course, what you'll see is, especially with the 2020 census, is once again, reapportionment, just to kind of tie into the political. This would be a great question, as a matter of fact, if you were to take a map like this that maybe was, had a bit more data on there, and you tied that to the political unit and said, okay, let's discuss the impact of migration on, the electoral college, or, changing distribution of where population is with regards to representation and possible gerrymandering. Okay. So here are a few question stems to get you to think about the items that we just talked about. Identify and describe is always a good one. You could identify and describe migration patterns, during the early 20th century and how that impacts language usage. That would be a great one. Explain the degree to which, so that could be kind of the same thing. Explain the degree to which language usage is impacted by migration, kind of just a spin on what I just got done saying. But there's a lot of different ways that you can think about this particular unit, but make sure that you're always thinking how to connect it to development and political forces, centripetal and centrifugal forces. Think about migration with regards to Syria. That you could tie that into all kinds of things. You can tie that into economics. You can tie that into the economics of Europe. You could tie that into, migration from Syria. You can tie that into, stage 5 demographic transition in European countries. So there's a lot of different ways to think about these items. And it's important as you're preparing for tests to try and anticipate what the test maker is going to be doing. This is a great one that I like to use to show my students. Now, if you look at this particular FRQ, it says predominant church affiliation by county, not by country, by county. And of course, this is the United States, and there are a couple of different religious groups here. And you don't know what they are because they haven't told you. So you're thinking, well, Mrs. Smart, this is an FRQ about culture and religion, not about migration. But hang on a second. Let's take a look at the rest of it. So part A says, using the letters in legend, name 3 religious groups shown on the map. Okay, so we know, and most of your textbooks probably have this exact map in there. And if you don't know the answers, I'm going to say, go look at your textbook, because I can probably guarantee it's going to be on there. You have to be able to identify the 3 religious groups here, right? Great, you can do that. The next one talks about, for one of the 3 religious groups, first identify and then explain 2 factors. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. 2 factors that have influenced the distribution shown on the map. Okay, so this is where your migration comes into play. Do you see that this is all about migration? Because it's asking you to identify and explain 2 factors. There's 4 things you have to do in part B. ID and explain 2 factors that have influenced the distribution shown on the map. So you have to pick one of these religions on here and talk about migration. Okay. And I'm not going to give you the answer here, but that's pretty much what you need to do for this particular FRQ. So I think that's it for my slides. Yeah, that's it for my slides. I hope this has helped you to review the migration concepts for the AP Human exam. Have a great afternoon.